The morning light on my property usually arrives like a quiet apology. It spills over the ridgeline, softens the pasture fence, and dapples the tall grass with dew that glitters like a constellation. Most days, I breathe it in as proof that I chose the right life, the life of sweat, earth, and the slow rhythm of animals. But that morning was different. There was no peace, no apology. Instead, there was a black sedan parked squarely in the middle of my best hayfield. Its tires pressed into a space that had never been meant for wheels. The car looked out of place, foreign and insolent, as though the very land had been colonized overnight by a symbol of power I never invited. I leaned against the gate, arms crossed, watching the sunlight catch on the polished hood. The license plate was county registered. The bumper marked with a plastic emblem reading HOA board in crisp white letters. The windshield reflected my face back at me, indifferent, almost mocking. In that moment, the car wasn't just a machine sitting where it didn't belong. It was an emblem of intrusion, of entitlement wrapped in steel. My land was supposed to be mine by heritage and mortgage, earned by years of patching fences under the sun, by nights spent nursing livestock back to health, and by the memories planted as surely as the apple trees at the edge of the yard. This wasn't just soil. It was where I taught my children how to spot Orion in the winter sky, where I buried the old collie who had guarded our home like a sentry, and where generations of effort lay beneath the surface like roots too stubborn to be pulled. The car had no right here. Its presence felt personal, as though someone had walked uninvited into my kitchen, put their feet on the table, and dared me to object. Around here, the woman behind the act had a reputation. Folks called her Karen with a knowing shake of the head and a conspiratorial chuckle. Her real name was Margaret D. Hawthorne. She was the president of our neighborhood's HOA, though president sounds far more democratic than the reality of her reign. She thrived on power wrapped in procedure, spoke with the cadence of bylaws, and seemed most alive when wielding meeting minutes like a sword. She never cared for my way of keeping the property. Once, she knocked on my door to hand me a flyer about front yard aesthetics, suggesting my walnut tree was unkempt. Another time she arrived with a clipboard, pushing signatures for a petition about fencing standards. Both times I answered as politely as I could muster. This land grows wild clover for my sheep, not tidy boxwood hedges. The walnut tree provides shade for my pasture path and the children who climb it. Margaret's face, framed by a pearl necklace and pressed blazer, always cracked just enough to reveal her distaste. Her victories came in ink and fines. Her defeats were buried in footnotes. The car in the hayfield, then, wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. The cruelty of it made my chest tighten. This wasn't simply a vehicle. It was a flag staked in soil, declaring that HOA jurisdiction could stretch wherever Margaret wished. The chrome trim seemed to gleam with smugness, reflecting a worldview where rules bent to the convenience of those in charge. Seeing it there made me feel 14 again, back in the classroom where a teacher told me not to speak up, to let the grown-ups sort things out, to keep my dissent tucked away like contraband. If silence had always been part of survival, so too had resistance. And in that moment I felt the old tension between the two twisting in my gut. I wish I could say my anger was purely noble, born only from principle, but that would be a lie. My rage carried layers, years of small humiliations sedimented into something heavier than any single incident. There was the town hall afternoon when my objections to a sewer easement were dismissed as quaint. There was the day a board member suggested my property value would improve significantly if I tore down my barn and replaced it with a modern garage. There were the subtle but relentless digs at my work boots, calloused hands, my refusal to manicure my fields into suburban displays. Each slight was small, but together they pressed down until I could hardly separate insult from injury. The black sedan was simply the last straw, final punctuation mark in a sentence I never wanted. Written, I walked into the field, boots crunching the frosted grass. Up close, the car looked even more out of place, its gleaming body absurd against the hay stubble. HUD stickers and parking permits clung to the windshield as though they excused its trespass. There was no note, no explanation, no courtesy. I laid a palm on the hood. The metal was cold, unyielding, vibrating faintly in that way only unfamiliar things do. Around me, the farm carried on with indifference. A rooster flapped impatient wings. The foal blinked at the intrusion with mild curiosity. The barley bent in rhythm with the wind. Life moved on, as though to remind me that symbols of power only hold the weight we give them. That thought tempered me. I knew anger can be honest if used to build, but monstrous if used to destroy. I told myself I wouldn't be monstrous. Yet there are mornings that rewrite a person's vocabulary. Afternoons that erase the punctuation marks they had carefully prepared. That afternoon, I did the reasonable thing. I called the HOA office. My voice was calm, deliberate. I described where the car sat, made it clear the field was private property, and requested its immediate removal. I left my number. Hours later, I received not a phone call, but an email forwarded by some assistant whose name I didn't recognize. It thanked me for my patience and assured me the matter would be reviewed. Bureaucratic time moves differently from real time. Reviewed meant responsibility would sink layer by layer into meetings, committees, and calendars until nobody remembered who had been wronged. My impatience began to harden into something theatrical. I imagined a scene so undeniable, so dramatic, that even the stone-faced language of protocol couldn't ignore it. The thought wasn't cruel. It was symbolic. It was about reclaiming the sanctity of my field, the soil where my children laughed and my collie slept beneath the apple tree. But plans are fragile things. They fracture under the weight of consequence. That night I paced the barnyard under a spill of electric light, boots scuffing against packed dirt. The animals stirred uneasily, sensing my agitation. Across the road, porch lights glowed warm in the early dark. My neighbor, old Mr. Larkin, ambled over with a thermos in hand. He asked his questions slowly, the way old men do when they don't demand answers but offer the chance to spill. I told him some of it: the car, the insult, the silence from the HOA. I didn't mention the fantasies of excavators and dramatic lessons. He listened with patience, honed by decades of seeing hot tempers lead to foolish outcomes. His face, lined like a map of every hard season, reflected consequences I hadn't yet dared to name. That night I slept poorly. My dreams pirouetted between images of Margaret, stern and bespectacled, and my younger self silenced in classrooms. The farm, usually so forgiving in its nighttime quiet, felt like a judge. Every rustle, every creak of the barn roof seemed to tally up my choices. By dawn, I felt the weight of clarity, the kind that comes not from impulse, but from the steady calculus of a life spent making small, hard decisions. Action was necessary, yes, but not spectacle. My response couldn't be a blueprint for harm. It had to speak a language of intent, not destruction, so I began differently. I filed a complaint with the county sheriff citing trespass. I walked the fence line, checking markers to ensure every inch of the boundary was accounted for. I posted photos of the car to a private neighborhood group, asking pointed but civil questions. And when I finally spoke to Margaret weeks later, it wasn't in the shadow of a barn or across a heated fence line. It was in the bright lights of a public meeting where words were recorded, where witnesses sat in folding chairs, where truth had room to stand on its own legs. I wanted more than vindication. I wanted the record to show how it feels to be dismissed. How easily institutions forget that land is not just acreage but memory, sweat, and inheritance. The car eventually left. But not before the story tangled itself into petitions, testimonies, fines, and apologies. There was no cinematic moment where tires sank into the earth under the bucket of an excavator, no gasps of shock. Instead, there was the slower, quieter work of accountability. And yet, the image of that sedan remained burned in my mind, an emblem of arrogance answered not with vengeance, but with the steady force of civic gravity. That summer, I learned something that wasn't particularly poetic but deeply practical. Anger is a tool. Like any tool, it can build or it can break. My choice, though difficult, was to build. When the car finally left my field, it did so without drama. Without the triumphant sputter of a cinematic getaway or the chaotic energy of a showdown. Instead, It departed with the sober shuffle of paperwork concluded and a flatbed truck that took up more space at the end of the lane than the sedan had ever occupied. I watched from the porch, arms folded, as the crew winched the car onto the truck bed, chains clinking with a kind of metallic finality. Margaret stood nearby, her posture stiff, her expression carefully arranged into neutrality, though her eyes betrayed something closer to fatigue. She had spent weeks building her defense out of bylaws and precedent, out of minutes scribbled in tidy handwriting and clauses she carried like armor. But in the end, it wasn't the bylaws that decided the matter. It was the neighbors, the people she presumed to govern, who showed up to speak. They didn't speak about property values or landscaping regulations. They spoke about the collie buried under the apple tree, the foal who had taken its first trembling steps in the pasture, the summer nights when children roasted marshmallows until their fingers stuck together with sugar. Her authority ebbed not because she was defeated in a technical sense, but because she had been reminded that real power rests in the collective memory of community, not in the sterile pages of a policy binder. Summer thickened and eventually relented, bleeding into the softer gold of fall. My hayfield recovered its rhythm, the cut stubble giving way to the new green of late shoots. On the surface, everything returned to normal, the low hum of tractors, the distant groan of a school bus, the crickets rehearsing their nightly chorus. But beneath that ordinary music, there was a new hum, quieter and more profound. Conversations that once revolved around HOA directives shifted into something gentler, something more relational. Neighbors met at fence lines to talk about weather and calves, not citations. People who had once slipped complaint letters into mailboxes began leaving baskets of peaches on porches with handwritten notes. For you, the air itself seemed less judgmental, as though a kind of pressure valve had been released. It wasn't sanctimony or self-congratulation, it was simply a recognition of shared ground, both literal and moral. For me, though, the aftermath was less tidy. Life rarely offers the clean resolutions we see in stories. There was still a small claims hearing, where the question of damages had to be answered. I sat at the plaintiff's table, stiff in a borrowed jacket, while Margaret sat opposite, her pen tapping quietly against a legal pad. When she spoke, her voice carried the crisp precision of someone used to being heard, but it sounded thinner than it had in any neighborhood meeting. The judge, uninterested in theatrics, asked for facts and figures. In the end, financial damages were calculated, and an apology was read into the record, delivered by Margaret as though she were reciting lines from a script she hadn't written. There were fines, too, and a probationary period that required community service and letters of restitution. These outcomes had weight, but they weren't the whole story. The deeper reckonings came outside the courtroom. In the private spaces no statute could dictate. Margaret began writing notes to people she had offended over the years. At first they read like perfunctory gestures, stiff with the language of obligation, but gradually they softened. The handwriting grew less practiced, the details more personal. She began to describe not just her regret, but her recognition of the harm she had caused. Change, I realized, doesn't come in grand gestures or sweeping transformations. It comes in increments, like a wall being taken apart brick by brick, carefully, by craftsmen who respect the stone even as they dismantle it. Watching her slowly undo the arrogance she had built her identity upon was strange. It's almost unsettling, but also deeply human. I kept a journal during all of this, not because I thought the story would someday matter to anyone else, but because I needed to record a ledger of truth against the temptation to rewrite events in the haze of memory. In its pages I noted dates, conversations, the exact way the light fell across the pasture when the car was finally gone. I also cataloged my own conscience because in quieter moments I realized how close I had come to making a different choice. Retribution had been an early temptation, a hot, bright thing that promised satisfaction. But clarity, I learned, is not purchased by ruin. It is earned in testimony, in the willingness to sit through long town hall meetings and let your voice tremble in rooms designed to reward. Polish and pedigree now and then. People ask me if I felt vindicated. The question always struck me as too simple, almost childish. If vindication means the relief of knowing I was right, then yes, I felt that. There was a strange satisfaction in hearing the word trespass acknowledged by law, in seeing neighbors nod their heads when I spoke about the sanctity of land. But if vindication means the petty pleasure of watching someone else suffer, then no. I didn't feel that. The day the flatbed truck hauled Margaret's sedan away, I didn't feel like a victor. I felt relieved. Relief is a different kind of emotion. It doesn't look backward, tallying up wins and losses. It looks forward, asking, what now? The what now became the work of repair. With the help of neighbors, I replanted the torn section of pasture. We gathered one Saturday morning, a ragtag assembly of families, scattering seed with the enthusiasm of children tossing confetti. Kids ran laughing between rows, hands sticky with juice boxes, while their parents raked and tamped down the soil. The sheriff who had once taken my complaint even showed up with his wife in a picnic basket. Setting aside the uniform to share sandwiches under the apple tree, the laughter that day felt like a healing balm, replacing the tense silence that had hung over the field for weeks. To my surprise, Margaret came too. She brought coffee in thermoses and an apple pie she said she had baked herself. Her volunteer hours, mandated by the court, could easily have been performed elsewhere, somewhere less awkward, but she chose to join us. At first her presence was stiff, her hands hesitant as she pulled weeds and spread mulch. But over time, the stiffness thawed. She listened more than she spoke. She laughed once, softly, when one of the children nearly toppled into a pile of compost. Hospitality, I realized, is one of the most underrated tools of reconciliation. You can legislate fines, you can mandate service. But it is the act of breaking bread in this case, pie that begins to smooth the jagged edges of resentment. Meanwhile, the HOA itself began to change. Long-serving board members, perhaps wearied by the controversy, quietly retired. New faces appeared, younger and less enamored with rigid order. Meetings shifted in tone. People spoke more about dialogue and less about enforcement. Eventually, the bylaws were amended, not gutted, but reshaped to include a clause requiring notification and consent before enforcement actions on private land. It was a small procedural shift, but meaningful. Rules like riverbeds shape the way the water flows. Change the channel, and the current finds new, often gentler paths. But not all consequences were external. In the quiet of my own home, I wrestled with the uncomfortable truth of how close I had come to another ending. There were nights when I lay awake imagining what it would have felt like to act on my darker impulses, to use an excavator to make a point, to reduce the car to a lesson written in bent steel. On paper, those fantasies carried the allure of justice, tidy and undeniable. In reality, they would have poisoned relationships and scorched the ground I had sworn to protect. Even harm justified in the language of defense leaves a residue, staining soil and soul alike. Choosing a slower, more public path was not a perfect act of morality. It was simply pragmatic, born out of love for land and community and a desire not to lose myself in the process of defending them. Time did what time always does. It softened some edges and sharpened others. The pasture healed, growing back with a richer weave of grass. The collie's grave received a new marker, hand-carved by neighbors during a small, quiet ceremony. Children who had once glimpsed the conflict from across the lane now played freely again, their laughter filling the field without shadows attached. Margaret, to her credit, attended a community potluck that winter. She read aloud a short note about lessons learned. Her voice was steady, but her hand trembled slightly when she signed a condolence card for the widow who lived next door. It wasn't absolution, but it was a beginning. The story that began with trespass and swelling anger concluded not with a moral lesson delivered in thunderous finality, but with reconciliation, messy, uneven, fragile, like a sapling just beginning to take root. People do not transform overnight. We become better, if we become better at all, through small choices repeated with quiet persistence. My farmhouse, which overlooks the pasture, now carries a small plaque nailed beside the porch door. It reads, "This land is held with care for those who plant, those who rest, and those who listen." It isn't triumph. It's covenant. If I had to distill the whole ordeal into a single truth, it would be this: justice without remorse is hollow, and anger without boundaries consumes the very thing it seeks to defend. I did not sink Margaret's car with an excavator, did not carve my outrage into the earth as a warning. Instead, I learned to use my anger as a tool for accountability, not destruction. The pasture, in time, returned to its honest work. It grew hay, hosted picnics, and carried the gentle gossip of crickets at dusk. It held, in its ordinariness, the memory of an ugly morning and the slower, kinder work that followed. That, I have come to believe, is the truest reclamation of all.